Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Slang, and I am the Membership and Business Development Associate at Digital. And I am pleased to welcome you to our IP webinar, Canada's AI Voluntary Code of Conduct. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada, we live, work, and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. As myself and much of the Digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants afterwards. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address them at the end during the Q&A portion. And with that, I will pass it to Jen.
Thanks, Ben. Bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have attendees joining in from across the country for this month's webinar. And whether you're new or a returning participant to Digital's IP series, we're thrilled that you could join in for this Thought Leadership Power Hour. Next slide, please. Generative AI is giving rise to intelligent systems that can generate creative content, mimic human-like behaviors, and revolutionize the way we interact with technology, offering enormous potential for innovation and already being adopted and put to use in a variety of contexts. However, it can also result in adverse impacts and carry a broad risk profile, which is why Canada has taken a proactive approach by developing and announcing a voluntary code of conduct on the responsible development and management of high-impact AI systems. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll walk through the evolution of generative AI and the code of conduct as one part of Canada's ongoing development of a robust, responsible AI ecosystem. Hear from one of the code's early signatories and key considerations for proactive approaches organizations can take, with a Q&A portion to close us out. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation, setting the framework for projects that address cross-industry challenges while creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are but one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's panel. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Armitage, Nathaniel Lipkiss, Sam Ip, and Simon Hodgett. Jonathan is lead machine learning developer at Alta ML, one of North America's leaders in responsible applied AI for private and public sector organizations, and has over a decade of experience applying statistical and machine learning in various industries. He's been actively involved in building and deploying ML solutions spanning the fintech, healthcare, and sports sectors, and his passion extends to applied ML, as well as areas such as explainable AI, responsible AI, cost-sensitive AI, and user adoption. And fun fact, Jonathan in a previous life was a professional baseball player in the San Francisco Giants organization. Nathaniel is a partner in the intellectual property group at Osler, who works on patent, commercial IP, and life sciences regulatory issues. He is a registered Canadian patent and trademark agent, and a significant part of his practice is assisting and emerging high-growth companies with business-critical IP issues, including IP and large acquisitions, strategic IP licensing, risk management. He has also advised on international trade-related IP matters, having served as chair of IPIC's IP Trade Policy Committee during Canada's negotiation of CETA and Trans-Pacific Partnership, and industry recognized by IAM Patent 1000, Thomson Reuters, and the World Intellectual Property Review.
I also wanted to be a baseball player, just pointing it out, but no organization would have me.
Thanks. Sam is a partner in the technology group at Osler, who regularly works with AI companies and organizations making use of AI technologies. His practice includes technology, procurement, and contracting, and a significant focus on advising clients on complex and thorny issues related to the use of data and open source software. A licensed professional engineer and former engineer at BlackBerry, Sam is also a certified information privacy technologist and has been recognized as one to watch in IT law. And last but not least, Simon, a partner in the technology group at Osler, whose practice concentrates on outsourcing, complex service arrangements, and procurement, and advises both enterprises and technology suppliers, leading a team providing innovative legal service models to the firm's high-growth technology clients, including fintech, AI, data analytics, blockchain, ag tech, and e-health. He is also past president of the Canadian Information Technology Law Association, a lecturer in various areas of technology law, and recognized by Canadian legal expert Who's Who in Chambers Canada. We have a powerful panel today, and with that, Sam, I hand it over to you.
Great. And so I think, Simon, I think you'd probably pass it over to you to kind of kick off the presentation, and we will come in as appropriate.
Okay, thanks very much, Jan, for that great introduction. Why don't we go to the first slide, Nathaniel?
You bet.
So as Jan indicated, I'm a partner in the technology group, and I've been a partner in the technology group for over 20 years. And over those years, we've seen waves of what are seen as revolutionary technologies come and go and get integrated into businesses and enterprises and become sort of everyday use tools. But there's a legitimate claim, I think, in the AI and particularly generative large language models and so on, for that this is a revolutionary technology, and it's of a different type than we've seen before with other waves of innovation in the technology space. And I think just to share a little bit, we are doing in our practice an exponential amount of work for clients in the AI space. And it's fair to say that what I think is unique about it is that it's an astoundingly effective technology. It's not entirely intuitive the way it works with respect to understanding the difference between the concept of prediction and certainty, logic and prediction and machine learning and so on, but also the way that users and individuals and companies interact with the technology. I don't think we've seen a technology before where the interaction with the user has such a potential to influence the benefits of the technology and the downsides of the technology and the risks with respect to things like insertion of data that should not be included, biased outputs, and so on. All of those things require careful thought, and we're seeing reaction across a number of sectors and a number of jurisdictions to those concerns and the fact that this is something quite different than we've seen before. So we're going to talk today about the code, and it's a very good example of how the institutions that are in existence are now reacting to this very different technology and the risks associated with it. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to kick off with a brief primer of the technology, and Jonathan and Sam, I think, will lead the discussion on that. Then we'll dive briefly into other regulatory frameworks, because the Code of Conduct is part of an ecosystem that is growing internationally and in Canada, as with various legislative and policy reactions to AI technology. Then we'll get into the code itself. That's where we want to spend most of our time. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about some additional risks around IP and so on. So I'll hand it over to Sam, I think, to kick off that discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon. When it comes to AI and generative AI, it's always a good idea for us to kind of start with the jargon and what we're talking about before kind of leading into the code itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about the primer and some of the risks that kind of gives rise to kind of necessity of something like a code of conduct. And so very simply, when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's a concept. And it's really kind of, the ability of computers to carry out tasks that, you normally associate with human behavior. A lot of times when we kind of read and hear about AI, things like kind of natural language understanding, natural language processing, Siri, self-driving vehicles, we're really talking about a specific way of implementing AI, and that happens to be machine learning. And machine learning, as the name suggests, is really learning from kind of examples. And so we'll talk about the next slide is exactly what we mean by machine learning. And I'm going to invite Jonathan after that to kind of comment and color his views. So if we can go to the next slide for a moment. When we talk about machine learning, often I use an example. Let's just say you want to teach a machine how to generate, I guess, squares. You would show the machine different sizes of squares. You would show it different colors of squares. And rather than trying to program it and tell it what a square is, by showing enough examples, the AI solution, AI model would come to conclude that a square probably has 4 sides and 90-degree angles each. And so it kind of come to construct its own rules of what a square should be. And so when it comes to generative AI, once it's learned those rules of construction, now you can ask it, well, now generate a square for me that is this large, this tall, and that's blue. And having learned from the examples, it's able to do that. And that's the kind of machine learning kind of component. 2 things to kind of underscore, and one is the importance of these data sets, right? As you can imagine, as representative as it is of these data sets, the more accurate it is. And so you sneak a circle in there, all of a sudden, it sees enough circles, it might get a little bit confused on what a square actually is. And so a lot of focus, when we talk about generative AI and AI, with the importance of data sets, its influence on output and even performance, and even some of the related risks. And Jonathan, we're quite privileged to actually have you here to join us, and not it's not every day that we kind of have somebody who is at the forefront as a data scientist and kind of an ML engineer on this. And so at the risk of oversimplification, I want to invite you to add any additional color at the forefront of kind of ML, any additional comments you might make to ML.
No, thank you. Thank you, Sam. And Jen, thank you for the introduction as well. I think you kind of hit it on the nail on the head there. ML at a high level, learning from examples, trying to reason about things that when you try to encode them within a rule set, the rules just become so massive that it really can't reason about. And in the generative framework, this idea of generating these like textual elements or whatnot, as Simon said, it's kind of been a game changer. The original paper came out in, I think, 2017 out of Google for transformers. So it's been around, but this, last 8 to 12 months has kind of just been a whirlwind. But I think one of the things just to think about in this generative AI, but the frameworks in general that we're talking about with machine learning, is they're probabilistic structures. So they're not deterministic. What that means is that I can put one input in and get one output out. I put the same input in, and I can get kind of a little bit different output. And that is what underlies this system, as Sam was saying. If I showed a lot of squares and then I kind of permuted a little bit with some circles, that output of a square, yeah, I'm pretty certain, but it could be a circle, right? So always under the understanding of these, especially in this generative AI paradigm that we're under, is this idea of determinism versus probabilistic behavior, and just being very aware of it as we go. And whenever we make decisions as humans from decision theory, it's usually probabilistic in nature. We just don't realize that we're doing it. And these large computer systems now, the neural networks, as was on the other side, that have been developed, are just, they have so much underlying data, the training data that they're trained on, basically the internet at large, it just becomes a massive prediction engine. So I think it's really interesting what's going on, and happy to add to the conversation and these codes of conducts and whatnot. But Sam, I'll pass it back to you, and we can kind of keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think that those are some good comments, Jonathan. And, if we go to the next slide, some of the comments that Jonathan had made, about the way that generative AI works is it is not deterministic. In other words, the output could be a little bit different. And it could be different each time. It does give rise to a basket of risks. And what you see on this slide is, what Simon, Nathaniel, and I, and perhaps even you, Jonathan, we've come to call these kind of ecosystem risks. If you're going to be developing, deploying, and making use of AI, in this case, we're going to be talking about generative AI. These are risks that organizations will need to confront. And so some of them will not be new. If you're using generative AI, of course, the input data you put into generative AI systems and the output that you get could give rise to, of course, potential copyright kind of risks, infringement risks. But also when you're building some of these models, when you build some of these very sophisticated models, we use the example of squares, but that's quite a simple example. But when you start thinking about, natural language understanding and processing, you need lots and lots of examples. And in those cases, what better examples than taking it from kind of the internet, at large? And just as you might have read the news this morning from CNN.com, if you scrolled all the way to the bottom, there would be terms and conditions. And those conditions would have said, you can only use the content to consume it, but not kind of do anything commercial with it. And so there's always concerns about when you're building these kind of large language models, respecting the terms and conditions of that. And of course, there are the concerns that, Jonathan also talked about, which is some of these models may not be perfect in its output because they're only as good as the data sets. And so, we use the squares and circles example. You're teaching it how to detect squares. You get a circle in there enough times, it might start to think some circles that are not perfectly, round in some places, it might start to make some mistakes. And so you might have heard the term hallucination because it isn't, deterministic. Some of those are kind of real risks. Data sets that aren't perfectly kind of aligned with the problem. We always hear about examples where, there's a lot of kind of male in construction. And so you're developing a use case in construction. It could be skewed male and it could create kind of biased outcomes that really don't reflect a different kind of use case in a different kind of more diverse kind of settings. And so exacerbates a lot of the harms that kind of Simon has spoken about and really gives rise to organizations really thinking about, given these risks, kind of what we can kind of do about and what kind of guardrails and guidelines they need to really be kind of thinking about.
I was just going to add one quick point is when we think about risks as lawyers, we're normally thinking about risk of harm and somebody suing us. When we're talking about intellectual property risks associated with AI, there's actually another facet, which is the loss of an opportunity and the possibility that if you develop something with AI, you can't capture ownership of it. And we'll get into it later, but it's just another way of thinking about risk in this context that you have to keep in mind because it's getting to be bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And mindful of some of these risks. And Jonathan, let us know if you have any kind of comments on your side. But I think some of these risks firsthand, as even your organization is developing generative AI solutions, are the very same risks you're looking to kind of mitigate. And that's what gives rise to things like a code of conduct or some sort of guardrails to kind of guide that development.
Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway is, as we're at the ground level of development, not actually developing the large language models, the ChatGPTs, those per se, but the development of systems that will be integrated, as Simon said, into business processes or things like this is as an organization trying to really be thoughtful and forward-looking and understanding of the potential risks, the potential adverse effects. And the way that we've come to figure that out, and just through experience, is if we can get a cross-functional team together to kind of like brainstorm. Here's the problem. Here's what we're thinking. What could be adverse outcomes, right? Because when you get lots of different individuals, different backgrounds, different areas in the organization, they might think of these problems much differently than, say, I would from like a mathematical standpoint. And then the other area that I think is really interesting when we're talking about risk mitigation strategies, especially in the era of Gen AI, is if you can come up with some sort of ontology, some sort of lexicon for the risk. So like we've got 7 here, kind of high-level buckets that once we kind of start defining these, we can kind of point to them and maybe add some buckets as we go. That allows us to develop a framework, better understanding, better education internally, as we're really trying to think through these. And then the last thing, I think, from a development standpoint for any risk or software development process, and I'm going to quote Dave O'Connell, our internal software engineer lead, is sometimes we just got to take our hands off the keyboard and like think about what we're actually doing. What are the risks? What are the benefits? In this era, because it seems like a new blog comes out every day, right? It's sometimes difficult to do that. But having the discipline, the foresight to think through these things, I think will only show downstream the benefits because we can all rush to a keyboard and code up something and throw it out there, but that's usually not a great idea, I found.
Yeah. Jonathan, there's a comment, there's a question in the chat, and so happy to address in real-time context. And the question is from Michael, thinking about the risks outlined, do you perceive any of the mentioned risks will become more pertinent or dominant than others? And is it always context and industry specific, which risks applies most? And I mean, I can certainly share my views in kind of a paragraph, and curious to the views of others as well. I think it has to be. Things have to be kind of contextual. And that, in fact, is why it is very important for some of not only regulation, but some of these codes of conduct and guidelines to be proportional in kind of its consideration. Even when we start talking about governance, and I know Simon will be kicking off that discussion, when we talk about governance and policies, the general guidance is that it's really hard to talk about risk in the abstract, because then we're covering things at a high risk and low risk. And I think the question is always, what is the use case here? And in that specific use case, it may be that it doesn't really matter when it comes to kind of accuracy if this is kind of in a game setting, but it matters a whole lot if it's making a decision where, it could potentially impact the denial of benefits to individuals, decisions that are irreversible. And so I think as a general comment, they should always be kind of considered in context and in the use case.
Sam, I think that's right, and there is a lot of guidance and consideration, and some of these things we're going to talk about today on that, because there's a lot of thinking gone into consumer applications, credit, credit decisions, automated decision making that affect people's rights. There's been some good work done in some of these different codes and standards, identifying the categories of AI tools that are of significant concern. So it's there. There's a lot of work being done on it, and there's lots to access. So. Okay, so it's amazing how quickly time goes by. Some new slides, but on just as I was mentioning, there's a lot of work obviously going on, and a lot of activity internationally. The EU has an AI regulation that is a number of initiatives going on. Most recently, the White House, the Biden document that was the directive that was issued, which is more directive than previous documents that came out of the White House, which makes directions to specific government departments in the United States to consider a number of these. There's a significantly useful discussion in those documents about some of the national security risks, for example. Then obviously in China, there's draft rules as well. And look, we could fill this map with 25, 30 dots. There's lots and lots of activity going on. And what I would say is, and this is a theme I think we can pick up, that this is actually a good thing. We're deriving some kind of generalized principles and standards that we can all agree with, or to a certain extent. You'll see that there are generalized themes developing. Is actually a good thing, because we all need to contend with these issues, and the variety of ways that they're being addressed is a very useful thing to refer to. Maybe go to the next slide. Okay, in Canada, so emerging regulations and commitments. So there's a number of bills. We've talked in your group before, I think, about ADA and the actual legislation relating with artificial intelligence, the CCPA, and Law 25 in Quebec. So those are legislated requirements. So the privacy reform legislation is relevant, and of course ADA is part of that. So it's all in process. We'll have one very quick slide about that in a moment. Then there's the voluntary safeguards, what we're talking about today, the ICED Code of Practice. the Montreal Declaration, which has been around for a while, which was a really useful ethical guidepost for the creation of AI, and the OECD principles, which are cited in numerous contracts and instruments that I deal with. And then the federal government has been active as well. More generally, they have a directive on automated decision-making, dealing with automated decision-making within the federal public service. And then they have a guide on generative AI. So once again, we could probably stack more into this deck. There's a lot going on. And I think it's worth reflecting on why. And the reason is all of those risks we just talked about. At the same time, there's opportunity. So there's a view that by having guidance and legislation and principles, it's possible to create an ecosystem where we are able to tap into this technology, get the benefits from it, at the same time addressing the important policy issues.
Simon, do you think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks when you're dealing with imposing regulation in this area? Because I mean, one might say, well, the less regulation, the easier it is for companies to just develop whatever they can and compete with countries where there may be less regulation.
Well, I think that I think there's a general consensus, and Jonathan can maybe comment on this, that and his company has subscribed to the code, so I think he probably agrees with it. Is that at the end of the day, some guidance is useful. Now, how they do it is open to debate. ADA is extremely controversial in many respects. One of which is we'll see that it requires more development, but at the same time, there are those who are more interested in doing sectorial regulation because it's more specific to the risk in each particular sector, and say that it's too soon to be doing a generalized AI approach. Now, the EU has taken a generalized approach, although it's very different than ADA. So I think that I don't actually advocate for the fact that there should be no regulation. I just don't think that's realistic. When you look at that map on the previous page, and I could have, as I say, we could have had 25 dots on there. The world is reacting, and how you react and being smart about regulation, I think, is really important. But to say that there wouldn't be regulation, given the important societal values that are impacted by AI, I think is probably not realistic. Jonathan, did you have a view of that?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, I'm bought into what you said, right? Like, no regulation, the cat's kind of out of the bag here, right? So we're using these things and imposing some sort of regulatory framework. As you mentioned, how it's used or implemented is one thing. Just makes a lot of sense in this space. Because it could become, the wild, wild west kind of idea, but having some sort of like generalized idea of what we're trying to operate under in high level guideposts, I think makes a ton of sense. And, we were, AltaML is an early signatory of the voluntary code. And, for us, it was kind of a no brainer given, we've taken a real hard stance on responsible AI. And, when you look at kind of the voluntary code, kind of the tenets it's laying out versus responsible AI and kind of what we're doing there, it wasn't a large jump. So, but I am good. I think no regulation would be probably not the best thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as a tech lawyer, when I was quite a bit younger, starting out, we were regulation free virtually. Apart from, there was a little bit of privacy coming along, and you had to look out for some tax implications, but there was very little regulation in the space, and that's certainly not the case now. I think there's all kinds of areas where there's going to be regulation. So, and
I think the other thing, just to piggyback off right there, Simon, is in the Gen AI space, which is so much different than like classical ML space or paradigm. The underlying training data that these systems are using, let's say an OpenAI, you really don't have access. You don't really know kind of what's flowing in and out of them, and why certain things are occurring, right? So, or even how the data sets were created, right? Were they created by just a large web crawler, you know, like these different things. So having better understanding into those, I think, at least from a development perspective, allows for better understanding of the system as a whole. And I think then could elicit trust as we're going down, as we keep iterating on these processes.
That's great. Thank you. And so just a very quick slide here on it. Jen was telling us that you'd already done a session on it. So risk-based approach, and the application is private sector organizations design, develop, or make available or use artificial systems in international and provincial trade. You know, it's still very much up in the air how this is going to play out, because I think the government has gotten some feedback. And maybe just go to the next slide, Nathaniel. So in September, Minister Champagne did signal there would be amendments. So there would be defining classes that could be considered high impact. For those of you who know ADA, that's a huge question mark in the current legislation. And specifying distinct obligations for generative AI, because generative AI, of course, really has taken off in the meantime. So you can see here some of the signals the government has given that there's going to be changes to ADA. Now, that sets us up for the discussion of our topic today, really, because as we get into the code, the question is the thinking that's been developing, is that reflected in the code? And we're going to see some of that in ADA. So maybe we'll just move into that given the time.
Wonderful. And so it hasn't been a very long time since the code was kind of published, which was really only September 27th. And the code of conduct, you know, it was published after a very brief kind of period where an earlier draft was made available. And what's interesting is, you know, the code's positioned as really critical bridge between now and when kind of ADA comes into effect. And so in some ways, some view this as kind of an interim kind of document that organizations can look to. And what it does is it covers advanced generative systems. We'll talk a little bit about, you know, what that means or doesn't mean. And 6 elements, 6 baskets of measures that organizations would kind of commit to. Now, it is a voluntary code. And to date, you know, 16 organizations have signed up to it, include, of course, AltaML. And so for this kind of segment, we're going to have kind of a live discussion, you know, between the 4 of us about some of the elements of this code, some comments about what it looks like, how it's been received, and some practical kind of takeaways on what we can kind of expect. But maybe I can start off with, Jonathan, maybe I can ask you to start. You know, this voluntary code, I mean, AltaML is a signatory to this code. Maybe you can ask from your perspective, what was AltaML's reaction kind of to this code? You know, this code comes at a time where there are already, you know, various other kind of international codes kind of in the works or you know, already published. What was kind of your reaction, and what were the factors that you had kind of considered when you made the decision to kind of sign on to this code?
Yeah, great. So, you know, the factors to sign on to this code, as I mentioned earlier, our co-CEOs, Nicole Jansen and Corey Jansen, and internally have made a big focus on responsible AI. You know, these systems are powerful, generative or not. They're in all things that we do, even if we don't know it. And having the tenets or the pillars of being responsible in what we're doing is just kind of at the forefront of everything we do, especially on the development side. So a jump into this paradigm, this voluntary code of conduct, wasn't a large jump organizationally from the developers on the ground level, all the way up the chain. So, you know, that was our thoughts. How it's been, you know, obviously how it's been taken by developers or whatnot, or everybody inside, is pretty positive. I mean, I've heard some things that when putting out little feelers is, you know, moving from the voluntary, like how long will this bridge be? Like we need to get to actually like something that actually is not voluntary. So maybe organizations are saying, oh yeah, we're doing that kind of idea. But largely it's positive. And I take it the positivity was it was somewhat already ingrained. If I look at accountability, fairness, these different kind of tenets of the code, they stem from this responsible AI paradigm. And so that was kind of a natural fit.
Yeah. And Jonathan, just to add kind of color to that, we work with kind of a number of clients, and that view certainly resonates with kind of a contingent of our clients as well. And just to offer kind of the spectrum of views, there are those that look to this, of course, as kind of really a federally endorsed set of guidelines, and it kind of more or less mapped to things that they were doing, or areas of kind of consideration that they were putting in place to mitigate risk, but also to promote kind of responsible adoption. Then there are other kind of questions that some organizations have responded to, and it was along the lines of, there are various kind of standards out there. There's the Biden commitments of the states, and then of course coming out of there's the G7 principles, and part of the reaction is assessing everything and trying to find kind of a common denominator to comply, and that was some of the reactions as well. But two more comments I'll make. From the perspective of organizations that don't develop generative AI, this code came as a bit of a perhaps, I don't want to call it a map, but a set of guiding principles for organizations that are adopting or using AI in terms of what they should look for when they're partnering with AI-related vendors and service providers. And it gives them, again, a level of kind of consistency. On the other hand, with respect to kind of AI vendors that are developing AI solutions, they're also looking to this code because, of course, they're the ones that are providing services to organizations, also looking at this code as well. And there's been a fair amount of attention on what they feel like they will eventually be kind of expected to comply with as kind of a pseudo kind of standard. And some of the reactions from those AI vendors now, when they get to looking at this code, is starting to really look at both very specifically the definitions and the specific requirements to assess how easy and how challenging it can be to kind of comply with.
So interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I was just saying, I could see both sides, and obviously the definitional component of drafting some general AI regulation is always interesting, right? So like, what is an artificial system? Like, what does this even mean? And, what are the technicalities? So I totally see that. And when I was reading through the definitions as well, and I was on a call yesterday with a colleague, and kind of like they were involved in some of the mappings in the EU, and like having these really long in-depth conversations of how to even define these things, right? And I could see that being an interesting conversation.
So you've hit the nail in the head. If we go to the next slide, we've excerpted some of the measures in the voluntary code, just really for discussion, Jonathan. And when we talk to some of our clients, some of them will say it is something that they're considering voluntarily adopting. So they're working through this, and this code covers advanced generative systems, and that's often their first kind of stopping point. And they ask themselves, and the code doesn't actually have definitions, what meets the test of an advanced generative system? And is what is advanced today, if they come to that conclusion, is that at some point in time going to be kind of less advanced and more run-of-the-mill? And often that's the first starting point. I'm curious, Jonathan, to your view, especially your kind of boots on the ground, when you read a definition like advanced generative systems, is that a term that you would generally kind of have some sort of ballpark understanding what that might be?
Ballpark understanding, yes, right? Lots of vagueness around it. Yes, I think, and it's all relative as well. Like in advanced, the naive Bayes classifier, which is a generative model, may seem advanced to some, but simple to others, right? So, these things is trying to put them in context of what you're doing and what you're working with, the stakes that are at play, and the actual system that you're using, right? So, yeah, I'm in agreement that it makes it a little bit more difficult, but at a high level, right? Like if you're trying to think of in the abstract and maybe in like, does this kind of check some of the boxes? Yes, let's move forward, right? Instead of being kind of bogged down in some of these things, unless necessary.
So that's a really interesting comment you make, because in my, what I'm hearing is that this voluntary code is a useful kind of companion, but it's a guidance document in terms of how you're kind of looking at it. It sets out principles that are very useful, but you don't treat it as something that is kind of well defined, but something that gives you directionally where you should be headed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the document as a whole is exactly that, and to this bridge to this other thing to get us thinking forward, thinking about what to do, and having these principles. A quote that I love from my colleague Craig Haney. Sometimes you give somebody a blank piece of paper and say, "Hey, draw me a city." Right? They just look at the piece of paper. Right? They don't know, like, where do I go? How do I start? What do I do here? And the minute you kind of put a line down the middle and say, like, this is a road or something, right? They start drawing some bushes and some skies, some different things, right? And so these principles, accountability, safety, transparency, right, get you moving in that direction of actually like, oh, that makes sense, right? And how do we actually implement it or use it, or in what regard?
And I think that approach is very consistent with the reactions we're hearing as well. How to approach a document like this. And so, for those who've kind of dialed it, this is an excerpt in table form of the measures that an organization would be kind of signing up to or committing to. And they spent 6 categories, from accountability, safety, and you see those here, to kind of fairness and equity, transparency, human oversight, and kind of monitoring. And for each of these kind of baskets, the measures. And so you can see here, for example, assessing and curating data sets. And they get toggled on depending on whether the advanced generative systems is available for public use, or if it's not, or whether the role of the organization is one of a developer or even kind of a manager itself. But, Jonathan's point is a very interesting one, because I think when a lot of our organizations that we work with look at this, they come to very similar conclusions, that it is probably more appropriate as a guidance document, because the boundaries of what is a generative system or not, it is not defined, and there's a level of judgment. And I think that probably is the right frame of mind to look at a code like this. The other comments that, a lot of times organizations, when they look at this, is they ask themselves the first question: where am I in the AI kind of, where does this apply to me? Do I develop? Am I a developer? Am I a manager? Do I make available systems for public use, or do I not? And they ask themselves those questions. And if it's a bright line, it makes it, there's a bit of bogging down by the details. And so I think you're absolutely kind of right, Jonathan. When we work with this kind of code of conduct, a couple of comments, and I want to kind of focus on a couple of key areas. There's references to proportionality, which I think is the right approach, because it kind of reflects that not all risks are equal, and it has to be a use case, by use case kind of consideration. But there are also some elements here that are a little bit challenging to comply with. And I want to talk to you about some of them, Jonathan. For example, when we talk about transparency, and if we go back one slide, that often is one where it attracts a lot of discussion. If you look at some of the requirements, publishing information about capabilities and limitations, it doesn't go so far as to talk about how things work. And I think that's extremely helpful. But sometimes, to your point, it's hard to always do that. But some of these requirements go on to say, if you look at transparency, it says you have to develop and implement a reliable and freely available method to detect generated content. I want to pause it for a moment, because some of the views we've heard is that sometimes this can be kind of a challenging undertaking to kind of commit to. And just curious to your views, Jonathan, this is just an example of a few others, how your organizations have approached some of these voluntary kind of commitments like this.
I think as you read down these measures, whatnot, as you're saying, use case dependent, the stakes that are underlined of the use case or the domain. But when I look at the one develop, implement, this, whether the content was generated, is a watermarking, right? right. So when I look at these, you maybe could bucket them as, yeah, we like, this is documentation. We need to make sure that this is how we did it, methodologies, model cards, data sheets or data sets. This one in general is quite difficult in that there's been some research that's come out. There's been companies that have tried to kind of flag things that are generated by these systems. And I don't know if it's gotten to the level yet where that is something that can be easily implemented. I do definitely understand the near-term focus with the audiovisual because of deep fakes and things like that. Phone calls, you hear about these scams, which needs to be taken with some foresight and thinking. But I think you're right. How do you implement them? And I totally understand from certain organizations that are trying to get off the ground or not. Like how many resources do we devote to documentation? As you move forward in each of these principles.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there will be some implications to kind of how this code of conduct will be used. And we can kind of touch on that. A couple of comments just to kind of round that off as well. Thoughtful implementation will be very, very important. And now if we take the freely reliable and method to detect AI-generated content, if you look at the chart, it says that it's the responsibility of developers that make for public use advanced generative systems. And if it's the case that you're a developer that makes available advanced generative systems, but you rely on a foundational model, or you rely on kind of a third party to provide you that base model, you can expect that sometimes while it's not in the voluntary code, it may be the case that in order to support someone who is making it available for public use, the requirement will kind of flow back upstream to organizations that don't. And so there's a bit of a ripple effect to some of these obligations. Another one is publishing the description of types of training data used to develop the system. Now, it is relatively general in how an organization might want to do this. Will again require kind of thoughtful consideration. I mean, on one hand, it would be a competitive disadvantage sometimes to divulge a unique data set that might help you create kind of the solution that the organization is creating. But in other cases, it could also be a source of attracting liability as well. And so some of these requirements, I think that when we look at the transparency requirements in totality, they're looking to get at is really to how to address this kind of trust deficit, or to kind of foster trust with kind of the individual and the user base. But each measure will need to require very thoughtful application, kind of as organizations kind of roll them out. I want to talk about kind of practical implications to kind of this voluntary code. And Jonathan, I wonder if there's any other measures you want to specifically focus on, but I want to spend some time on talking about kind of what we can expect and how we can kind of see this play out. And I'm happy to comment on that. And also, I know Simon also has experiences that we're already seeing application of this code, even in our own kind of practices within different organizations.
I think the biggest takeaway with any of these documents, as you're saying, or as you're developing these systems, is, I think you hit it, is the thoughtful development, right? Is trying to be thoughtful about what's going on, understanding the stakeholders involved, understanding the end use case that it's going to be deployed within, and trying to reason about the system as a whole. It can be pretty difficult. These systems are massive, right? So maybe not we're trying to reason about the weights underlying it, but the general capabilities that you're expecting, I guess, right? So like some sort of expectation idea.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing too is that there's a dialogue going on around these risk elements, and those dialogues lead to contracts. So we are looking for ways for the parties to allocate risk and to take active steps. So it's not just a matter of liability risk. Take active steps to avoid bad outcomes when they're contracting for systems And I think the useful contribution for the code in particular, because of the way it's drafted and it's a principle based document, is it provides categories for parties to work with, and even some thoughts. Going back to Michael's question, what are the categories of uses and the roles of the parties, differentiating how you look at those kinds of risks. So I think that's really useful. I quite liked that differentiation by use and role when this came out. But also I think each of these items is something that when I'm working on a contract dealing with this topic, we're looking at these types of instruments, including some of the other international ones, and looking for ways to have a discussion to make sure that there aren't and drawing on the thinking that's in the code is one place that we're going to be stopping and looking at. So
yeah, I think that's right. And although it's only been kind of 2 months since the kind of publication of this code, we're starting to see this code kind of pop up in contracts already. We're certainly seeing organizations reference this, and sometimes even one of the things I've started saying, at least at the firm, is don't be fooled, depending who you are as an organization. Although it's a voluntary code of conduct, it comes up in sometimes contracts where it's less than voluntary. But it goes back to the point in some of the comments that Jonathan had made. And so sometimes we see, an institution requiring an AI vendor to comply with this code. But we've picked up on some examples, and Jonathan's talked about how in practice it's not so easy to comply with. Another point Jonathan raised, is that the definitions are kind of blurry of what agenda systems is. Even some of the requirements are not kind of, they're intended to be guideposts. And so when we kind of see it in contract and imposed in contract, it's not drafted as a contractual document. And so it wouldn't be unusual for, as Simon suggests, this to be a document that perhaps serves as the basis for how to address some of these concerns. But certainly compliance is a little bit challenging to the T, just because this document is intended to set principles, guidance, and really directionally what would constitute kind of responsible kind of AI usage.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think it's a mistake to treat it as a statutory instrument, and we certainly see in negotiations sometimes, things that are not requirements will be characterized as requirements that must include this. Well, I think there's room for dialogue because of the way this is drafted. These are principles, and the parties can put some detail in themselves to get to the mandatory language. So
yeah. So Simon, one of the curious to have you now, just kind of branching off this and into kind of AI governance. Now, one of the key cornerstones of the code of conduct is really accountability, and it starts with accountability. And accountability, one of the measures that's required is, including establishing a risk management framework, a governance framework with policies and procedures. And wondering if I can pass it to you to talk a little bit about kind of governance, given that is one of the cornerstones on which the code of conduct is built.
Yeah, and with respect to generative AI, we're seeing it's developing for sure. But machine learning models and so on has been around for a while, and particularly in some of the financial services fields, modeling and prediction has been in place for a while. So there's always been policies and requirements dealing with the risks associated with that. But I think that it's fair to say that, and it goes right back to my opening remarks to this topic, is that there is a huge human element to the use of this technology and creating accountability. And I think that policies with respect to both using AI and developing AI and making sure within an institution that the accountability is clearly identified, both for what we're calling here a manager and then for a developer of AI, is quite important. And I think you could call some of these seminars on AI why your institution needs an AI policy, because I think you do. We're at the stage where this technology is being used, and we have principles and the code that's being promulgated here indicating to us that there are significant concerns and industry buy-in actually to ensuring that there's proper use of this technology. And I think that institutions of all types need to take into account how they're using it, whether they're developing it, and look at the principles in the code in particular, but also other sources, and see where that plays out within existing policies, or if they need to create some new policies around it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to give a couple of practical pointers, a lot of organizations, starting with accountability, a risk management framework includes things like having very specific roles, processes, oversight, and part of that also starts with where the organization is in the AI ecosystem. Are you developing AI solutions? Are you building on top of someone else? Or are you kind of using and deploying it? And all of that will inform kind of how you get at kind of the framework. And Simon talked about policies and procedures. And, two comments on that front. I mean, the two most common policies and procedures we often see is really a usage policy. And of course, when it comes to development policy. And sometimes we put an asterisk around how we talk about that. Because if you think about most organizations, they do have a confidentiality policy, a security policy, even a software development policy. And, it's often the application of what the organization has really in a new context. And so we can dive in a little bit more about what those policies look like if there are questions, but I want to kind of pass it back over to Simon.
Yeah, I think we are running low on time, so why don't we just proceed with the slides for a moment, see where we're at. Yeah, so this slide, which will be available to everybody, is really about where you might look, in addition to the code of conduct, for some principles and standards that are relevant to both policies and, frankly, if you're doing contracting in this space. There's a lot of work going on, and some of it is really very good quality work around AI and ChatGPT and generative AI in particular. Note some of them are general, some of them are like the ISO standards, some of them are sectorial, like OSFI is doing some thinking about this in the financial services area. And we can expect that there will be lots of sectorial policies and principles as well. So we'll leave the slide with you because we are running down our time, and I'm not sure if we'll have time for questions, but we'd really like to do that. I think Nathaniel will just these are just more of the same. So.
Okay, I won't spend too much time on the IP, but just to flag that there are some really important IP questions that are emerging. Practically speaking, if you develop an invention or a work with AI, can you actually protect it with a copyright or a patent? It's not a new question. When you had cameras created and photographs, there were people who said, well, that's not art. We shouldn't be able to copyright that. But it turns out that photography can be art. And similarly, there's real inventions and work that is created through these systems. Right now, the laws around the world are drafted in a manner where an author or inventor has to be a human, and there aren't really any outliers, but there's lots of policy work on the issue. And what's happened is it's become complicated to determine whether something that is created through a generative AI, but with a human operating it, is protected. And there's some a sort of a gray zone that didn't used to exist. There's some policy work being done through the government and through other governments to look into that question, and then other ones, other of the ecosystem risks that were flagged by Sam early on about, well, who's liable? Are you liable for data scraping? What if the output of the generative AI system has some copyrighted work that went into it? Those kinds of questions are thorny ones that are working through their way through the courts and through policy systems. And so the last slide that we have is just to say, well, you got to deal with these when you're allocating risk in contracts. And it's not as straightforward as we might like. So we're trying to stay abreast of it all and make sure that whenever we're dealing with these, we know we can give the best advice we can. The thing is, everybody has the same questions, and they are truly ecosystem risks because we don't have definitive guidance. And even if we did, it would be country by country. So we're doing the best we can. And so I'm going to stop there. I see we're at time. And so I'm going to let Jen grab the mic.
Thank you, guys. And I know we still have a few folks on. And so I just wanted to, as we talked about sort of teasing out from the chart, Jonathan, a little bit sort of to you from, let's say if there was, 2 or 3 things that you would ensure sort of from an organizational lens to mitigate risks around generative AI, from that developer lens, as well as that organizational management lens, I think would also be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, so from that standpoint, from the developer side, I think it's constantly trying to think through in a common sense way of like what these systems are doing, what they're generating, and how to evaluate these frameworks is probably something to think about from the developer side. But then from the organizational side, the one thing that developers don't like to do is documentation. I'll tell you that right up front. But so what we need to do is we have to have frameworks or templates in that kind of takes on that barrier of entry to documentation. So what we've done is trying to map these principles and put them into some sort of kind of templatized framework with examples that young developers, old developers like can go in and just kind of fill out in a few lines and move on. That we're getting the high level idea of what's going on through these systems as we're building them. So, and then the last thing from an organization standpoint is time, is giving your developers time to actually write that documentation. And I think that's just a big thing, right? And I think that's kind of why documentation kind of falls behind sometimes, is we don't feel like we have time.
Wonderful. And before I hand it back off to Ben to close us out, I wanted to also say thank you to all of you for your insights. And if there's one key thing that you want to leave the audience with before we close out, what would that be? And I pose that to each of you.
I think I'll start. I think when it comes to kind of the voluntary code, organizations don't need to start from scratch. There are resources out there. There are also tools as well, software tools that really kind of map to even the voluntary code. There's AI governance tools, and it's worth looking into because, of course, it supports some of the concerns that developers have. And I used to be one, Jonathan. I never liked to document either.
So my thing is just from the organization is thoughtful development. Take your hands off the keyboard every now and then. Think about what you're actually doing. Instill some common sense, but also confidence into your development, your team, and to think about these things and have real conversations with all the stakeholders involved when you're developing these. And make it an open space if someone sees like adverse things that could happen, that they make sure that they're put to the right individuals.
I can go next. I'm going to be speaking strictly about IP, and it's get comfortable with the fact that there is risk that you can't fully mitigate right now. And if you want to win in this space, you're going to have to get comfortable with it. Some of the large players have said, we will indemnify you for if you get sued for this, because they know that if they want to build and they want others to adopt, then they're going to have to take on some of the risk. It's a big bet. It might not be a winning bet, but it's the only way to be in the game. And so you just got to get comfortable with it until we have clearer guidance.
Yeah, I think my parting thought is that this is not going to get simpler anytime soon to contend with. This is a complicated area, and the technology is complicated. The impacts are complicated. And for those dealing with it, whether it's in a contractual place, dealing within contracts, or rolling out technology within organizations, give yourself the time to sort through it. There's a lot of great resources out there. There's a lot of great companies like Jonathan's out there who are working in the space, giving a lot of thought, and give yourself the time to work through it, because it's not going to get simpler. It's really a tremendous time of opportunity, but it takes time to work through all these issues.
Thank you, Simon. And on that note, I'd also like to thank you all. Merci for your time, carving out of your busy schedules to share your insights sort of with our attendees today as they move forward in sort of discussing and tackling this. So with that, Ben, I hand it back to you.
Awesome, Jen. Thanks again to all of our speakers, our attendees. So stay tuned. We will be distributing the recording, like I said, and as well as some information regarding our next submission in the IP webinar series. So with that, everybody, have a great rest of your day.